My name is Sarah Beth, and this is What I Wish I Knew About Christian Sexuality, Episode 5, Harmful Sexuality. Before we get into the video, I just wanted to put a quick trigger warning for anyone that has sexual trauma. This video may be triggering to you. I get into a little bit more specifics about things like sexual harassment, abuse, and domestic violence, as well as adultery or cheating. So if that might apply to you, just watch it with caution. Although I do feel like it's really validating to hear the truth. I personally have experience with these things, but learning about it and sharing this information is really important to me, so that other people know and can avoid these types of things and not be naive when these circumstances occur. So the first thing I want to do is define harmful sexuality. Harmful sexuality is ways of expressing our sexuality that brings physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual harm to other people. Basically, this is what not to do. So I'm going to break this up into two main sections. The first part is going to be all informative. We're going to be covering adultery, sexual harassment, sexual assault, and domestic violence. The second half is going to be me telling you stories of people that were affected, not in a very graphic way, but just so that you know about it, and then a call to action. So let's get into it. The first form of harmful sexuality that I want to address is adultery. So adultery is basically when one person in a relationship cheats on another person by sleeping with, flirting with, etc., another person that is not in the relationship. So I won't touch too much on what the Bible says about adultery. We talked about all of this though in the second episode, What Does the Bible Say? But what I wanted to talk more about with adultery in this episode is the harm that it causes to people. Adultery harms marriages, quite obviously, and children. Children may experience feelings of confusion, anxiety, abandonment, and isolation, not unlike the partner who was cheated on. This is important to know because when you cheat on your spouse, and let's say you have a family together, you're not only affecting your spouse, but your entire family involved. So it's a pretty loaded action to do. Moreover, just with your partner themselves, betrayal is really hard to correct. Psych Central says victims of adultery or cheating, they might experience symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. Instead of a shock to your system, as with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, discovering cheating can be a mental shock to the system you've built as a couple. It can be really disorienting to know that someone that you once trusted isn't able to be trusted. And so it's really important to understand that and to give yourself grace in those situations because you can't control what happened to you, how you respond to it. Now we'll move on to sexual harassment. So sexual harassment is a huge umbrella category compared to something like sexual assault. Sexual harassment includes unwelcome advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. Some more known examples would probably be like unwarranted, all of these things unwarranted, sending explicit photos to someone, unwelcome touching or sexual advances. But some more uncommon or unacknowledged forms of sexual harassment can include making sexual jokes that make people uncomfortable, recalling sexual instances even if it's not about the person you're speaking with, especially if it's without their approval, feeling pressure to engage with someone sexually, or any physical or verbal actions that might make someone feel sexually uncomfortable, even if that was not your intention. It's important to understand that last part, the intentionality. Some people will make mistakes and will get reported for sexual harassment, but as long as you understand that you weren't intending to do that, but it made them uncomfortable, and you stopped doing that, then you're good. But if you keep doing it just because you're like, well, it wasn't my fault, you need to think about the person that you're doing it to and the fact that it's making them uncomfortable, whether you like that answer or not. That's legally how it's handled. If you think that you've been a victim of sexual harassment, first try talking to someone about your situation and share how you're feeling. Depending on the environment you're in, authority figures may be able to help you. There's a lot I can personally get into regarding the logistics of how to approach this situation, but honestly, it just depends on the situation itself. RAIN is a great resource for understanding sexual harassment and how to better approach it. Although I say that if all else fails, removing yourself from that environment is the most important thing because you're protecting yourself physically and mentally. Sexual assault, however, is much more specific. Sexual assault is the penetration of a victim's body, known as rape, attempted rape, or the forcing of sexual acts such as oral sex or any penetration, even without the penis, i.e. their hands, of the perpetrator's body, and fondling or unwanted sexual touching like kissing or groping. Basically, if the sexual act occurs without consent like we described in the previous video, then it is sexual assault. If you think that you've been a victim of sexual assault, there is help for you. I will put the phone number on the screen that you can call, as well as all the websites down below and other resources that may be of use to you. Both of these issues, sexual assault and abuse, can affect you in a multitude of ways. Emotionally, you may feel angry, fearful, humiliated, shameful, guilty, betrayed, violated, or powerless, out of control. Mentally, you'll probably experience anxiety, depression, panic attacks, PTSD, difficulty concentrating, demotivation, abuse substances, or have suicidal ideation. Physically, you'll probably feel more stressed, have headaches, and have trouble sleeping and eating. I can tell you from personal experience, all of these symptoms are accurate. I've gone through every single one of these symptoms. It's really frustrating and they're very hard to go through. So just know that you're validated if you are struggling right now. But here's the truth of the matter. None of these things are okay. I think that's obvious, but I'm gonna just say it now. In the church context, I think that sometimes it's not as obvious though. These actions should not be justified or treated with grace as many churches might lead you to believe. You might be able to forgive your abuser one day, but a whole lot of trauma comes with these situations that you need to work out on your own. And that requires effort and money for a therapist and ultimately time. In my trauma recovery from these types of situations, I found that surrounding myself with people that truly support me was the most helpful thing. The people that I thought were my friends turned out not to be, and that was really difficult to go through, but it was also really important for me to realize so that I could actually surround myself with people that truly loved me and cared about me. And I know that this may seem kind of lame to say in response to some of the things that you might be feeling if you have gone through this, but God ultimately knows what you need, and he's going to keep putting you in situations that will help you get through this, even if it feels like he put you in that situation to begin with. Moving on to domestic violence. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. Domestic violence can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, psychological, or technological actions or threats of actions, or other patterns of coercive behavior that influence another person within an intimate partner relationship. So some really brief examples of the ways that domestic violence can sneak up on you is physically. While it is known that there is domestic violence with physical harm, other forms could be forcing drug or alcohol use, or even denying medical care. Sexual, while it could also include sexual abuse, could also include treating someone in a sexually demeaning manner. Emotional could be undermining someone's self-worth or self-esteem. Economic could be controlling or restraining another person's economic resources to which they are entitled. Psychological could be any sort of intimidation, threatening harms to themselves or others, and this is probably the most frequent use, isolating that person from friends or family. And then technological could be anything that you see kind of like with cyberbullying, threatening to harm or stalk or harass or extort a person through technological sources. And with this also, there are hotlines to help. If you're in immediate danger, call 911. Otherwise, I'll put the National Domestic Violence Hotline on the screen and put sources below along with the other sources that I'm already including. What's crazy is that all of these things, especially domestic violence, is so common in the church. It's really sad. And the justification of which is found in 1 Timothy. Women should learn quietly and submissively. I do not let women teach men or have authority over them. Let them listen quietly, for God made Adam first, and afterward he made Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived by Satan. The woman was deceived, and sin was the result. When I say patri, you say archy. But really quick, let's define it so that nobody thinks that I'm just like throwing this word around for the sake of it. A patriarchy is actually a very established system in society that goes back for centuries. I would even argue that it's not good or bad by proper definition, but the exploitation of which is what makes it bad. Traditionally, a patriarchy is a system of society or government in which the father or eldest male is head of the family and descent is traced through the male line. However, over the years, the definition has evolved to also include a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. Do you see what I mean by that exploitation thing now? So this verse is kind of, it's so ridiculous. Timothy's logic is insane. It completely negates the fact that God trusted Adam too, and that Adam shoved blame onto God by giving him Eve in the first place. Moreover, just because Eve was deceived by Satan doesn't mean that women should be subject to abuse forever on. And lastly, if we were to ignore the feats of women like Jael or Ruth or Esther or Mary, these women were excellent examples of being God-honored despite their gender. As C.R. Horton says, This continual theme of viewing women as less worthy is what leads to the condition of objectification and allows men in contemporary Christian culture to view women as an it to be owned and used for pleasure. Victims are blamed, and usually those victims are women. I do acknowledge that there are male victims out there, and I think it's even more difficult for them because of this patriarchal structure that we have set up and the idea that a man is weak if he lets a woman treat him that way. Further, Christian women are likely to remain an average of 3.5 years longer with an abusive partner, and they are more likely to return to an abuser after leaving because of this aversion to a divorce. And this is made even worse because when a woman is trying to deal with this type of situation, regardless of whether it's domestic violence or abuse or harassment, she also experiences spiritual abuse because she's told she needs to be more submissive or know her place and work harder to please her husband. But here's the truth of the matter. William Loader, a theologian, says that women in the early Jesus movement were welcomed not on the basis of suppressing their sexuality, let alone abandoning or shielding it from men, but as women including their sexuality on the basis that men who follow Jesus would take responsibility for their sexuality and not reduce women to the level of sexual objects or threats. Don't let anyone, for any reason, convince you to stay in a relationship or situation that hurts you in any way, shape, or form. Because remember, God grants everyone dignity. So now I have a couple stories for you, just to kind of give you a little bit more of an example of ways that things can pop up and ways that it can affect you. Because honestly, it is such an injustice to not know ways that other people can hurt you, especially if it's happening so often. So I've had many Christian friends who have gone through the things that I've described earlier in this video. And I had one friend in particular whose experience was that she was in a relationship and they had premarital sex, and then she felt compelled to get married to this person because of it, and she ended up in a really abusive relationship. Prior to that, she had been in a few other types of manipulative relationships where red flags were raised, and some may go and blame her for ignoring them, but that's where they're wrong. You see, the situation is a twofold, and I have experience with this effect too. The first half is that the church that she and I had attended and been raised in raised women to see men as admittedly imperfect, but as helpers to Adam, they must be gracious in all experiences, regardless of the severity of the situation or the danger that it put the woman in. The other half is that once these women are in abusive relationships, the psychological effect takes over. You see, it's common in abusive relationships for a partner to feel completely dependent on another person, to the point where they cannot see their life without that person in it. And then the abuser further endorses this belief by convincing them that they also need them, while also blaming everything on them too and hurting them and doing all these things that are a part of abusive relationships. And then this tag teams with the "you don't know them like I do" effect, where nothing an outsider will say will get through to that person because their partner is acting different around them, thus feeding into that gracious helper that the church teaches. Some might not even realize that they're being abused because they buy into this idea so much. So women remain in these relationships confused because their intuition tells them that they're in danger, but everything on the outside tells them that they're wrong and that they need to stay. And by outside, I mean their partner in the church. So back to my friend. It took her reaching her breaking point to get her to leave that relationship. And when she did, she was blamed for not doing enough to save the marriage. A marriage that destroyed her mind, spirit, and body. And this example is way more common than you think. Now I have another friend who has a similar story. She too was in multiple relationships that had different red flags that were raised. She never learned the power behind the word no and boundaries because hers were never respected. She felt out of control, but like any human would, she kept pushing on, feeling like maybe the situation might change. Or eventually she'd get what she really wanted, which was companionship and love. So here's the big picture. For both my friends and myself, it took a good example of healthy male sexuality to change our minds, but the damage still remained. Each of us left situations that hurt us to eventually find men who respected us, understood where we came from, and loved us for who we were. The catch: my first friend and I left that church to be wandering Christians, and the other friend, the second friend, changed denominations altogether. Two of us could afford long-term therapy until I couldn't afford it anymore recently. We have trauma responses when we're triggered, something our partners have to help us carry. And what did the churches that condoned these relationships do? They did nothing. And what accountability did the individuals that hurt us receive? None. I tell this story to encourage people to change the narrative, and both men and women need to participate. I'll start with a message for my ladies. Hey now, ladies! First of all, you cannot keep blaming other women for things that men are doing. Sisterhood matters. I think some of the most painful trauma is the betrayal I felt when I told individuals what I was going through and they blamed it on me. That needs to stop. We need to come into these situations with open minds and think about how much courage it takes to talk about these moments and how desperate that person might be if it's gotten to the point where they're ready to talk about it. Now for the men, you need to hold each other more accountable. If you see or know that another man is hurting a woman, you have the right to tell him what's up. And that's hurting her mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. You are just as responsible when you see that happening. My situation snowballed from one guy to an entire group of guys goggling over my body in a situation when I was obviously uncomfortable. And not one of them held the others accountable because they were too afraid of isolating themselves. So don't be a coward, speak up. And the same goes for women. If you see a girl hurting a guy, you are also responsible for telling her what's up. So I know that this was a more somber episode, but I think that this is probably one of the most important episodes in this entire series. In my experience, knowledge is power. Knowing that this stuff exists might not protect you from it happening to you, but it will protect you from letting it continue on because you'll know what it is, you'll be able to identify it, and you'll be able to approach it in a more constructive way. Because treating it with grace is not gonna work. So first of all, know your worth. If you have been a victim of one of these things, it was not your fault. You did nothing to bring it upon yourself. You can't necessarily control what other people do to you. Like I said, you can only control how you respond to. And if you're able to, therapy seriously helped me so much in all of this. But if you can't, find a good group of friends that you can talk to, journal when you're upset about it. But honestly, therapy is kind of one of the major ways to get through it, and time. I hope you liked this video. If you did, feel free to give it a thumbs up. And if you like this series, I ask that you smash that subscribe button. In the next episode, we're going to continue this narrative of responsibilities regarding your sexuality and actually talk about the responsibilities of sex. So stay tuned for that video, and I will see you next time. Bye. I liked it.